Well, I caught it quite hot enough today, thanks to you. However, I forgive you. I think you might fairly remember that I was not in any way bound. I had no reason to be silent about that portrait. You never asked me not to mention it. Pooh, what a wretched room this is! Dark, and the window looking out into the yard. Your coming to our house is in no respect opportune. However, it's not my affair. I don't keep the lodgings." Ptitsin here looked in and beckoned to Gania, who hastily left the room, in spite of the fact that he had evidently wished to say something more, and had only made the remark about the room to gain time. The prince had hardly had time to wash and tidy himself a little when the door opened once more, and another figure appeared. This was a gentleman of about 30, tall, broad-shouldered, and red-haired. His face was red too, and he possessed a pair of thick lips, a wide nose, small eyes rather bloodshot, and with an ironical expression in them, as though he were perpetually winking at someone. His whole appearance gave one the idea of impudence. His dress was shabby. He opened the door just enough to let his head in. His head remained so placed for a few seconds, while he quietly scrutinized the room. The door then opened enough to admit his body, but still he did not enter. He stood on the threshold and examined the prince carefully. At last he gave the door a final shove, entered, approached the prince, took his hand, and seated himself and the owner of the room on two chairs side by side. "Ferdishenko," he said, gazing intently and inquiringly into the prince's eyes. "Very well. What next?" said the latter, almost laughing in his face. "A lodger here," continued the other, staring as before. "Do you wish to make acquaintance?" asked the prince. "Ah!" said the visitor, passing his fingers through his hair and sighing. He then looked over to the other side of the room and around it. "Got any money?" he asked suddenly. "Not much." "How much?" 25 roubles. "Let's see it." The prince took his banknote out and showed it to Ferdishenko. The latter unfolded it and looked at it. Then he turned it round and examined the other side. Then he held it up to the light. "How strange that it should have browned so," he said reflectively. "These 25-rouble notes brown in a most extraordinary way, while other notes often grow paler. Take it." The prince took his note. Ferdishenko rose. "I came here to warn you," he said. "In the first place, don't lend me any money, for I shall certainly ask you to." "Very well." "Shall you pay here?" "Yes, I intend to." "Oh, I don't intend to, thanks. I live here, next door to you. You noticed a room, did you? Don't come to me very often. I shall see you here quite often enough. Have you seen the general?" "No." "Nor heard him?" "No, of course not." "Well, you'll both hear and see him soon. He even tries to borrow money from me. Avis au lecteur. Goodbye. Do you think a man can possibly live with a name like Ferdishenko?" "Why not?" "Goodbye." And so he departed. The prince found out afterwards that this gentleman made it his business to amaze people with his originality and wit, but that it did not as a rule come off. He even produced a bad impression on some people, which grieved him sorely, but he did not change his ways for all that. As he went out of the prince's room, he collided with yet another visitor coming in. Ferdishenko took the opportunity of making several warning gestures to the prince from behind the new arrival's back, and left the room in conscious pride. This next arrival was a tall, red-faced man of about 55, with greyish hair and whiskers, and large eyes which stood out of their sockets. His appearance would have been distinguished, had it not been that he gave the idea of being rather dirty. He was dressed in an old coat, and he smelled of vodka when he came near. His walk was effective, and he clearly did his best to appear dignified, and to impress people by his manner. This gentleman now approached the prince slowly, and with a most courteous smile, silently took his hand and held it in his own, as he examined the prince's features, as though searching for familiar traits therein. "'Tis he, 'tis he," he said at last quietly, but with much solemnity. "As though he were alive once more. I heard the familiar name, the dear familiar name, and oh, how it reminded me of the irrevocable past. Prince Muishkin, I believe." "Exactly so." "General Ivolgin, retired and unfortunate. May I ask your Christian and generic names?" "Lef Nicolaievitch." "So, so. The son of my old, I may say my childhood's friend, Nicolai Petrovitch." "My father's name was Nicolai Lvovitch." "Lvovitch," repeated the general without the slightest haste, and with perfect confidence, just as though he had not committed himself the least in the world, but merely made a little slip of the tongue. He sat down, and taking the prince's hand, drew him to a seat next to himself. "I carried you in my arms as a baby," he observed. "Really?" asked the prince. "Why, it's 20 years since my father died." "Yes, yes, 20 years and 3 months. We were educated together. I went straight into the army, and he—" "My father went straight into the army too. He was a sub-lieutenant in the Vassilievsky regiment." "No, sir, in the Bielomirsky. He changed into the latter shortly before his death. I was at his bedside when he died, and gave him my blessing for eternity. Your mother—" The general paused, as though overcome with emotion. "She died a few months later, from a cold," said the prince. "Oh, not cold. Believe an old man, not from a cold, but from grief for her prince. Oh, your mother, hey ho! Youth, youth! Your father and I, old friends as we were, nearly murdered each other for her sake." The prince began to be a little incredulous. "I was passionately in love with her when she was engaged to my friend. The prince noticed the fact and was furious. He came and woke me at 7 o'clock one morning. I rise and dress in amazement. Silence on both sides. I understand it all. He takes a couple of pistols out of his pocket, across a handkerchief, without witnesses. Why invite witnesses when both of us would be walking in eternity in a couple of minutes? The pistols are loaded. We stretch the handkerchief and stand opposite one another. We aim the pistols at each other's hearts. Suddenly tears start to our eyes, our hands shake, we weep, we embrace. The battle is one of self-sacrifice now. The prince shouts. 'She is yours!' I cry, 'She is yours!' In a word, You've come to live with us, hey?" Yes, for a while, I think," stammered the prince. "Prince, mother begs you to come to her," said Colia, appearing at the door. The prince rose to go, but the general once more laid his hand in a friendly manner on his shoulder, and dragged him down onto the sofa. "As the true friend of your father, I wish to say a few words to you," he began. "I have suffered. There was a catastrophe. I suffered without a trial. I had no trial. Nina Alexandrovna, my wife, is an excellent woman. So is my daughter Varvara. We have to let lodgings because we are poor. A dreadful, unheard of come down for us, for me, who should have